And Dave, Gabby, and Max, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you from 2 different ModPo people's threads on this question of loving repeating. And I'm going to ask Dave, Gabby, and Max, and let's add Jake to that group, to respond in any way you like to this question of repeating. So Vijay Lakshmi Madali, who's been very active in ModPo this year, writes the following. Stein's passage on loving repeating is so fascinating. I'm coming back to ModPo after several times being here and getting stuck at this stage. By the way, that is a common experience. People get to week 4 and they get stuck. And they don't continue or whatever, they get stuck. This passage on loving repeating intrigues me. She uses the participles, loving, repeating, being. Some of them could be adjectives or participles. How does one unravel them? Is she going through a kind of sequence of childhood, youth, middle age, and then finally maturity? I don't know, but I'm into it. So that's Vijay Lakshmi. And then Deborah Tannenbaum wrote a reaction to repeating that has to do with the experience, sadly, that Deborah is going through with the situation of dementia. And I'll read part of what Deborah says, and then we'll go to Dave, Gabby, Max, and Jake. I'm thinking of my own complicated feelings about repeating. How can we feel impatient when listening to people repeating what they have already said? And how can we feel annoyed about having to repeat what we have already said? It's almost Steinian, that statement. How daily routines can feel both burdensome and comforting. How the context of our own mood and what is happening around us influences our relationship with repeating. It also has me thinking about my mother's dementia and how her conversation is mostly repeating. It helps me if I respond to my mom's repetitions as if each repetition was something new. In ModPo, we have talked about poets making it new. In conversing with my mother, I have learned to let go of expecting the conversation to progress to something new. It's a circle and doesn't follow a narrative arc. If I accept the repetition instead of resisting it and changing it, I can relax with it and allow it to be. I stay in relationship with my mom, and even with all the repeating, it doesn't stay the same. These conversations with her have helped change my attitude toward other repetitions that happen with others, such as my husband and his, quote, predictable apple. This was a reference to an earlier statement. Kate finds this very powerful. Kate, would you read a little bit of that passage, and then we'll turn to Dave, Gabby, Max, and Jake. I can't wait to hear what people are saying about this.
As I was saying, loving, repeating, being is in a way earthly being. In some, it is repeating that gives to them always a solid feeling of being. In some children, there is more feeling, and in repeating, eating, and playing. In some, in storytelling and their feeling. More and more in living as growing young men and women and grown men and women and men and women in their middle living. More and more there comes to be in them differences in loving, repeating in different kinds of men and women. There comes to be in some more and in some less loving, repeating. Loving, repeating, in some is a going on always in them of earthly being. In some, it is the way to completed understanding, loving, repeating. Then in some is their natural way of complete being. This is now some description of one.
Thank you, Kate. Wow, that was powerful. Dave Poplar, a thought on this? Any of what's been raised here?
The phrase solid feeling of being really strikes me. It seems like, in general, she is always striving to find some type of underlying foundation for meaning, for everything. And this is funny, but I did a search for Stein and football to find out if she had any experience with football.
Dave, why did you do that?
Well, I mean, she's from Pittsburgh, and she could have been a Steelers fan theoretically.
Wasn't she born in Oakland?
Apparently, what's that?
Wasn't Stein born in Oakland?
There.
No, she was born in Allegheny, which became Pittsburgh.
Okay,
so,
sorry. Stand corrected.
But But she did apparently attend a Yale Dartmouth game, and was asked about it in an interview. And she actually talked about how, for her, watching the football game, and at least some of the stretches before, seemed almost primal. And she talked about how it echoed in a truly American sense what she considered to be Native American type dances. So she basically felt that American football was sort of exhibited and emulated this foundational American thing that was, built into the land. So it just fits in with this idea, like how she's almost an evolutionary anthropologist, how she's always looking for meaning, and repeating seems to be something primal, that she's exploring for that same purpose, trying to find out where this meaning comes from, and this solid feeling of being. So that's just the thought I have.
Wow, there's a lot there. That is very cool. Okay, thank you. Gabby, your thoughts on any of this?
Yeah, I mean, first I'm just like fascinated by the sort of Gertrude Stein Steelers fan. What I was gonna say
who
is
knew? With this, some things happen in webcasts that you just don't expect.
what I was gonna say is that what I like about loving repeating as its sort of quintessential phrase is its pun, right? It's like, I love repeating, loving repeating, the act of really enjoying repeating, and also the act of loving doing itself again. Like loving is repeating, loving which is repeating. So loving repeating. And what's revealed there is that, like, for Stein, and I would honestly say for the Baroness too, there's a real kind of like erotic pleasure, and I don't just mean sexual, but I do mean that in repetition. Repetition is this mechanic by which Stein makes pleasure. She makes humor. She makes enjoyment. And it makes the work keep going in a very literal sense. And so I just think that's something to key in on. And one of the reasons I like week 4 is that, like, I do feel like the poets are having quite a bit of a good time.
Yeah. All right. We have talked in previous years about an erotics of repeating in Stein, and clearly that's what's going on here. But Deborah Tannenbaum is turning it toward dementia and her relationship with her mother, which is less about pleasure than about linguistic pleasure, than about the pleasure of learning to listen to someone who is in a mode that is experimental, one way to put it, or determined by physiological factors that we can't control, to put it another way. And repeating becomes a fact. Go ahead, Gabby, you were going to say something.
I was just going to say, I don't think that it's that different, though, because, I mean, one, I feel that what Deborah's narrative is saying is, I'm realizing that the repetitions signal a continued presence, which is pleasurable, like in the sense that the person being there is enacted by their repetition, and that's like what feels like copeable. So I feel like they're actually much more connected than we might seem.
Yeah, no, I think you're right about that. And, in the early stages of dementia, certainly the person experiencing it is more frustrated if you remind them that this is something we just heard. But if you tolerate the repetition, then there is a relationship that's being saved somewhat, instead of some kind of normative superego patrolling of language and the way it should be done. Max, what are your thoughts about loving repeating?
Well, I had come across Deborah's comments in the forum earlier. I also found them to be quite moving. I think that with Deborah's account of her mother and the dementia, I think that it raises, or it really sheds a light on the I guess on what Stein's major contribution is to this week, or sort of what makes Stein so difficult for people, is that there's a certain labor that goes into loving repeating, especially loving repeating language, that is not true of other forms of repetition necessarily. I think Kate at the beginning of the session was talking about how this kind of gets us towards or starts to this week starts to show what's like musical or perhaps like painterly in poetry and in music in particular. I mean, music is all about the repetition. I mean, especially like pop music and lots of folk music. It's very cyclical. It's very much about the same forms, the same melodies, the same sections coming back over and over again. Or I mean, if you're listening to like ambient music, stuff like that, it can be just like the same beat over and over and over again. And lots of people tolerate that perfectly fine. In fact, that's what they go to the music for, is for that kind of repetition. But in language, there's this thing you have to kind of get over you have to get over the non-communicative aspect of repetition, or the differently communicative aspect of repetition, which is why I think repetition is it is a fact of dementia. I think it's often, unfortunately, then it gets talked about as being sort of kind of abnormal behavior or something like that. And there's this work that goes into being with somebody who's repeating themselves, and this is where Stein is really useful, and I think where the comparison to painting and music comes in to play, is just in terms of like really thinking about why we can't tolerate repetition in language in the same way that we can elsewhere in the world.
And it's true that most people do not tolerate repetition. Why? Can you say why again? You were sort of talking about that, but what is so fingernails on blackboard for us about repetition?
Repetition in language, I think Kate was saying at the beginning that there's this expectation that language communicates, that there's this need for efficiency in communication it's a cultural value. It's something that it has to do with the speed of communication, with exchanging information, and it's very much a part of the way that people interact as well. There's this pressure on language to communicate efficiently, to get so you can always
and getting out of the game of efficiency it's a daring thing socially to say I'm off of that train. I mean, this was in Deborah's comment. In conversing with my mom, I've learned to let go of expecting conversation to progress. It's a circle. Doesn't allow for a narrative arc. I need to, in order to stay in relationship with my mom, I need not to progress. And in fact, I think, I'm going to turn to Kate and then to Jake, I think that's in the passage that Kate read. She's saying something about aging and generations and, right? So there's something about advancing, progressing, maturing, and yet when you think about typicality, cognitive typicality, you get people who start to repeat themselves, tell the same story. I mean, I am cognitively, I think, 99%. And okay, my daughter, who's here with me today, said, "Dad, I've heard that story like 6 times." What does that mean? It only means that I've lived a long time and I have a limited number of stories. But anyway, I don't know where I went with that. Kate, your thought, and then we'll go to Jake.
Yeah, just to build on what both Max and Deborah were saying, I think syntax is designed to be progressive, and what Stein does is kind of half reverse engineer the language, pulls it apart into nuts and bolts, and then allows, it sort of unveils how it works. And I love in this piece, I think in particular, it really jibes with what Deborah was saying about, it is Deborah, right?
Yes.
Yes, about her mother, how she repeats the word being, and it acts as both a noun and a verb. And that to me, what Deborah was saying about her mother and her repetition and her sort of like reiteration of her being, really, that's what I see here in this piece.
There's progress, though, if it's okay if I jump in. I think that I really relate to what Deborah's saying and experiences with my father for the past decade. It's tremendous progress to accept where things are and love the repetition and this acceptance. Our lives are, we're born, we live, we die. Or another way to look at it is, mornings have we woken up? That's a repetition, right? So our lives are made of repetition. So a parent might not remember a child, but the child remembering the parent, even though the parent isn't saying new words, the child, I look at my father and he doesn't remember me, but I remember him. And so it doesn't matter. There's no words. I mean, it matters. It's challenging. I don't want to diminish the grieving that we go through. But I feel like this piece is also about accepting the life cycle and being present for it, even if it's painful, is also loving repetition.
Yeah. Jake, what are your thoughts, Mr. Beard?
Yeah, like really interesting and powerful direction. And of course, it's making me think of how much, specifically in this piece and in general, the repetitions indicate representation of an experience, not of a specific message, and certainly relate to the question of just irritability, like a repetition in language makes us irritated. In my earlier life, I had this punk poetry band and I didn't wear earplugs. So occasionally with my family, it's like, what'd you say? There's a lot of repeating. What was the name of the band, Jake? That's not, exactly like experimental poetics. It's just annoying, but.
Hey, Jake, what was the name of the band?
Frantic Turtle.
Frantic Turtle. Turtle.
So
okay, Chris Martin, who's an aficionado of band names, is gonna steal that, I think.
Please. What I was saying is, I guess in that particular piece, as you go through it, like more and more in living as growing young men and women and growing men and women and men and women in the middle of living, like as you keep going through this poem, at least I get a sense of going through a crowd of people or just like something experiential. You almost like go moving across time through images of people. And I feel like that's often my experience with certain kind of Stein poems where you like hear the din of voices rising from a crowd or like a large grouping of people where language is coming not from one person, but from a certain group, and the experience of being flooded by all these multiple people being and talking and loving and repeating each other and mimicking, like that becomes a kind of like a poetic, transcendent, meaningful experience.
It's almost Whitmanian. It's almost Blab of the Pave. It's synchronous multivocality. I like where we're going this.